Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Goddles and Pat Cummings. Here is a quiz. In the 1960s, the civil rights movement preached nonviolence and sang, "We shall overcome." This group shouted, "Black Power." J. Edgar Hoover described their organization as the greatest threat to the internal security of our country. Well, to his credit, they did accumulate thousands of weapons such as anti-tank guns, grenades, automatic rifles, submachine guns, explosives, and loads of pistols. And who is this group? The answer? The Black Panther Party. Let's discuss. Well, warm greetings. Greg and I are glad to have Dr. Horne back on our podcast, one of our favorite friends of the show, to discuss your new book. And just for background, if people don't know who Dr. Horne is, you went to Columbia undergraduate and then got a law degree from University of Berkeley, California. And part of what we're talking about in the book occurred when you were in law school. And you've written 30 plus 40, almost 40 books. So welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
And we are here to talk about your brand new book, Armed Struggle, which is about the Greg, I sent Greg my copy of the book after I read it, so it's already well worn. It's a history of the Black Panthers, Black nationalism, and liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Remarkable book.
And the Communist Party too, I should add.
Very much so. We were talking. It's equally about the Communist Party as it is the Black Panthers. But before we get going on that book, I just want to say that this book is something that everybody should pick up. The one before this, it's the Counter Revolution of of 1836 about Texas, and you wonder why Texas is so crazy. They've always been crazy. And the secession, the violence, the Jim Crow laws, slavery, the fascism. This is anyone from Texas. You got to give them a stocking stuffer of that book. That's that. Tell us about your new book.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. This book, in some ways, is an extension of past work that I've done. Recall that I did a book on the Watts Revolt in Los Angeles, August 1965. I've done a few books on Hollywood, for example. I've done books. I did a book on Black Americans, the Mexican Revolution, which takes place in part in Southern California. And as your earlier comment suggested, I was involved with the Black Panther Party while I was living in Berkeley and in San Francisco in the early 1970s. There's correspondence that I quote that references my presence there. I mentioned in passing, I was teaching on a volunteer basis at a prison in Northern California, Vacaville. One of my students was then known as Donald DeFries. He went up in flames in a shootout in the early 1970s in Los Angeles. He was affiliated with a group then known as the Symbionese Liberation Army. And unfortunately, I had lent him my prized copy of Frederick Engels' tome, The Origins of the Family, Private Property in the State, which of course was never returned, which is a cautionary note about lending out books. And of course, I'm speaking to your partner, Greg, who just received my book from you.
Yeah, I look around and I have very few of your books because I lend them out. I give them. Once I've read them, just off they go. Let
You're not getting it back either. So
your book. I just want to talk about this book. Golly, I spent 10 days of my life reading this thing. It just goes on. It's 600 pages. it is detailed with the footnotes, detailed with the index. Do you have help doing these books? Do you have a team of people that help you with the research? It's just remarkable how scholarly the book is, and then when you read it, it reads like it's a story. So I don't know.
Well, my team is me, myself, and I.
Holy crap!
And I do hire an indexer because doing an index, at least from my point of view, can be very laborious. So I hire an indexer, but other than that, of course, I hire a copy editor
Right, right.
to try to reduce run-on sentences and other such infelicities. But basically, this is what I'm doing nowadays on a full-time basis. That is to say, researching and writing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let's start about with the beginning of the Black Panthers. 1966, you're in law school. Malcolm X is killed, and a young kid, 16-year-old kid, was shot in the back by the police fleeing. That was a Matthew Peanut Johnson, resulting in a lot of riots in protest of how the police responded. And two people were in college, in junior college at that time, and they started the Black Panther Party. Tell me more about that.
Oh, I'll be happy to. But for the sake of your audience, let me also mention that this book is based upon prior books that I've done.
Mm-hmm.
And so chronologically, I actually start the book in the middle of the 19th century because what I'm trying to do is establish a thesis about why Los Angeles and Southern California has been racked with violence, why the LAPD, the Los Angeles Police Department in particular, has been a vector of police terror. And I try to connect that to the uprooting of the indigenous population. There's been a lot of research lately on indigenous history. And one book in particular by Benjamin Matley of UCLA calls what happened to the indigenous of California as genocide. Actually, the book sort of reads like a legal brief because he's trying to connect the events with the Anglo takeover, so-called, in the middle of the 19th century to the genocide convention of the middle of the 20th century. And from there, I fast forward to the Bolshevik Revolution. That is to say, 1917, the origins of the Communist Party, which then sunk deep roots in the Southland, in Southern California, and in Northern California too, to be fair. And from there, I tried to connect the activism and what befell the Communist Party to the flowering of the Black Panther Party. That is to say, after the so-called Smith Act trials of the early 1950s across the nation, but particularly in Los Angeles, you saw the major tribunes for socialism marginalized to a certain degree because of these political trials driving people into exile, driving people into prison, into suicide, etc. But there was still a felt need in the Black community in particular for the kinds of themes that the Communist Party had been stressing, which then sets the stage for the arising of the Black Panther Party in 1966. Recall that Huey P. Newton, a founder of the Black Panther Party, who grew up in Oakland, admits that he was influenced by Paul Robeson, that as a student, he used to defend Paul Robeson. He admits being influenced by the Cuban Revolution. The same holds true for George Jackson, who was the prisoner in Soledad and in Folsom, who was quite the proletarian intellectual, who read voluminously, wrote voluminously, and obviously was deeply influenced by the Marxist tradition. In fact, I quote him as saying that he wanted to put a black face on socialism. He saw that as being a part of his enterprise. His younger brother, Jonathan Jackson, was quite precocious, a teenager who, as a high school student in Pasadena, edited a newsletter entitled Iskra. Some in your audience might resonate from that word, which was homage to a publication of the same name coming out of the prelude and actuality of the Bolshevik Revolution. So, unlike a number of other past histories that paint the Black Panthers as solely and exclusively being a product of the so-called Black Power movement, of the Black nationalist movement writ large. Now, there is certainly truth to that. I tried to bring forward the other part of the story, which is that they were deeply influenced by the Socialist Project. They were deeply influenced by Cuba, where Huey P. Newton spent quite a bit of time in exile. So this is the true origin story, if you like, as I tell it, of the Black Panther Party.
Greg sent me your book, the Ben Davis book, and we had you on a couple of years ago, which I had no idea of how integral the Communist Party was to the Black intellectuals that were trying to reshape things. And this book is equally about the Black Panthers and the Communist Party, I would say, and how the Communist Party supported these groups that no one else supported. You know, they were. I mean, you start the book with the Scarborough Boys, which is Scottsboro, which is loosely based on the Kill a Mockingbird, but that's that's the 9 kids that were just absolutely inappropriately accused of assaulting some girls in Mississippi, and it went on and on and on, litigation for years and years. And who was the only people that came to their defense? It wasn't really the federal government. It was the Communist Party, that came to their defense. And tell us about those. Tell us a little bit about that for people that don't know.
So in March 1931, 9 Black youth were hoboing. Reacquaint yourself with that verb, because the way this economy is going, there might be a resuscitation of that trend. That is to say, of unemployed youth riding the rails from town to town, looking for employment. They encountered 2 Euro-American young women who accused them of sexual molestation. They were on the fast track, like so many young Black men before and since, to being executed before there was an intervention by the International Labor Defense, headed by the Black lawyer William L. Patterson. William L. Patterson, of course, had roots in the San Francisco Bay Area as well, and decades later was a kind of counselor to the Black Panther Party and a leader of the defense to free then political prisoner Angela Davis. In any case, the International Labor Defense had an international and global network, and as I tell the story, this international and global network proved essential not only to the Scottsboro 9, as they were ultimately called, but also to the hammer blows inflicted upon U.S. apartheid. As I tell the story, U.S. apartheid saw the beginning of the end in the 1930s with the international campaign to free the Scottsboro 9, which of course led to major Supreme Court decisions that are still good law, helping to provide legal protections to beleaguered defendants. We also know that the Scottsboro 9 were part of a larger story, because even before the 1930s, you had beleaguered Black communities relying upon the international community, be it the struggle against slavery, for example, where British abolitionists played an instrumental and pivotal role, be it the impact of the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, on the fortunes, or should I say the misfortunes, that were to come with regard to U.S. slavery. So the Black Panther Party, in some ways, was a legatee of these heroic struggles, as evidenced by the presence in their highest councils of one William L. Patterson.
Greg, jump in here. Were you involved with the Black Panther Party when you were in grad school?
No, I was, they were not a big factor in Pittsburgh. I mean, there were nationalist groups in Pittsburgh. The Communist Party was in Pittsburgh, but the Panthers in the party, when I was in the party in the early 70s, we had one former Black Panther Party member who came from Philadelphia, but I didn't have much exposure to that. But what I enjoyed so much about the book, and which I dug my teeth into, really was the story about the Communist Party. A lot of that overlaps with my time, in the same way that Professor Horne was in the West Coast, was in Berkeley, and knew about the Panthers. I knew pretty intimately about the Communist Party from about 1971 on. So I found that intriguing, and it bogged me down because I can't read like you read, Pat. I just don't read through it. I've got to stop and read the footnote and think about it and digest it, compare it to what I experienced as well. But I think the important point that I just heard, and I think it's one of the great features of the book, is as much of the restoration of the Black radical tradition today is about, and Dr. Horne's a big factor in that, is this continuity between the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and the role of the Communist Party. A lot of people would like to see the civil rights movement as a brand new, out of nothing movement that sprung up around Dr. King. Same with the BPP. But as Dr. Horne tells so well, that still pays back to a legacy that our ruling class tried to suppress, and that is the work of the Communist Party, and particularly in fighting racism and advocating for African American people. So I'm really moved by how he brings that into this and how he brings that to the fore, and I hope it'll make other people discuss it, understand, and appreciate it even more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I should also say about that very important point that you've just rendered, that even with Dr. King's movement, and of course we all know that there's a holiday in honor of Dr. King, boulevards from the Atlantic to the Pacific named after him, awards, prizes, etc. However, there has been a systematic attempt to deep six, to bury his own ties to the organized left. Many have forgotten that one of his top aides was Jack Odell, who by the way, goes into self-imposed exile just north of Seattle in British Columbia, where he passes away just a few years ago at the age of 96. Recall that it was President Kennedy himself who took Dr. King into the Rose Garden of the White House to escape what he thought might be electronic surveillance by the FBI in order to instruct Dr. King to get rid of Jack. Dr. King says that he will, but then tries to maintain subterranean relationships with him, which then leads J. Edgar Hoover, the leader of the FBI, to call Dr. King a notorious liar, for example. Recall that Jack Odell was also a founder and editor of Freedom Ways magazine, which comes out of the orbit of the Communist Party. It's a popular magazine. I talk in the book about how Panther leader Eldridge Cleaver, when he was in prison, was a subscriber to Freedom Ways magazine. Recall that it was in February 1968, a few months before Dr. King was notoriously assassinated in Memphis in April 1968, that he appears at a benefit for Freedom Ways magazine in Manhattan, in which Dr. King sings the praises of W.E.B. Du Bois, who had passed away 5 years ago, 5 years previously, I should say, after going back to Africa to Ghana, West Africa. By 1961, joining the Communist Party at the same time. And Dr. King speaks glowingly of Du Bois's relationship to Africa and the Communist Party, for example. And some do not find it coincidental that somehow he was assassinated weeks later. So there is a story that historians are just beginning to tell about these tumultuous events that have led us to this present point, although admittedly, there are still many more stories to tell.
But you know, before you were coming on, we were talking about, Greg and I were talking about the absolute remarkable police violence that was occurring against Black people in California in the 60s. Oakland was primarily a white police force, very, very small percentage of African Americans at that time. And they were just completely brutal in how they responded to that population, you know, with the beatings. Obviously, there's some well-documented murders that occurred. And in relationship to King talking about, you know, we shall overcome, part of your book, Armed Struggle, is that this movement decided that we need to protect ourselves. And your opening book, when you're talking about some of the members going over to Africa looking for weapons, and the number, you know, the number of weapons that the Black Panthers had, they were a very well armed military force, remarkably so. And you know, we all know about them shadowing the police and making sure that they were being monitored. I don't know. Tell me the relationship of their military, their training, their relationship with all the Vietnam vets, the weapons that they had, and how important that was to their party and their demise, I guess.
Well, first of all, this book is in part a story about the fruits of the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, the notorious Second Amendment, which has been interpreted thus far. Oh, I see.
Yeah, I just held up a copy of the second, Race and Guns and Fatal Inequality by Carol Anderson, which is, you know, it's connects kind of what you're connecting to a certain extent.
So the Second Amendment helps to create this really unusual situation in the United States where there are more weapons floating around this society than there are human beings. And what happens is that this was taking place, as your comment suggested, at a time when there was this police terror, police violence unleashed, not least against Black Americans. And just as a footnote, as I indicated previously, this work should be seen in the wider context of a number of other books that I've done in recent years, particularly on slavery, particularly on anti-Blackness as a component of slavery, particularly a thesis that is threaded through this book, that a central, although unacknowledged aspect of US history is the fact that when slavery was abolished in 1865, the enslavers were uncompensated, unlike what happened in the British Empire, when up into the 21st century, you had the descendants of enslavers still being paid off by London. And so when the enslavers went uncompensated, you saw that a number of enslaving families, their fortunes plummeted precipitously, helping to engender fury, intensifying anti-Blackness, leading to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, leading to the rise of a Klan mentality that in some ways was then inherited by police departments, which then that kind of terror is visited upon the Black community. But at the same time that all of this is unfolding in California, California, as your map readily shows, faces Asia. And the United States, in the second half of the 20th century, is heavily involved in military conflict in Asia. And Korea, 1950 to 1953, and notoriously in Indochina, in Vietnam particularly, in the 1960s in particular, leading to conscription, drafting of young Black men in particular, who oftentimes are influenced by Panther ideology, with many of the key military bases cited in the Golden State, not least in San Diego, Dandy San Diego, as it terms itself, not least in Fort Ord in Northern California. And many of these Black soldiers, and to be fair, non-Black allies as well, were not adverse to having sticky fingers when it comes to weapons and turning them over to the Black Panther Party, which was quite well armed. But I should also say that I try to draw distinctions between and amongst various categories. For example, armed propaganda, armed self-defense, armed struggle. Armed propaganda, you saw that during the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, where the African National Congress would engage in ritualistic bombings that did not lead to civilian bloodshed. You saw that in May 1967, when the Black Panther Party, newly born, strides into the state legislature in Sacramento to object to various forms of legislation, armed, but of course, not firing their weapons. That was a case of armed propaganda. And then there's armed self-defense when the Black Panther Party headquarters was attacked in Los Angeles, December 1969, and they fought back vigorously, which was a turning point in the party's fortunes. And then August 1970, when the aforementioned precocious teenager, Jonathan Jackson, leads an assault on the Marin County Courthouse north of San Francisco, the reasons still are bathed in murkiness. There was one story that suggests he was trying to free his older brother, also aforementioned George Jackson. Another story was that he was only trying to liberate certain prisoners so they could get to a radio station to broadcast about the torturous conditions inflicted upon prisoners in general. But in any case, this led to the arrest of Angela Davis, who was quite close to Jonathan and George Jackson, which then led to a worldwide campaign in her defense. But also it led to fissures within the Communist Party, because as I reveal in the book, there were certain comrades who did not approve of the August 7th, 1970 action at the courthouse. They found it adventurous. They found it ultra-leftist. The proponents, including Professor Davis, saw it in the context of slave rebellions of the 19th century. But in some ways, that particular fissure prefigured splits in the Communist Party that were to emerge in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, when you saw Professor Davis and other of her closer comrades like Bettina and Herbert Aptheker and James Jackson and Charlene Mitchell and a number of others depart the ranks of the Communist Party. So this is all part of this larger and wider story that I tell in this book.
I was at the 1991 convention. I was elected. In fact, I think it's a rarity in the Communist Party. I was actually nominated for the National Committee by my district. Usually in the party leadership would recommend people that, and generally they were close to what's going on. They had a good perspective on things, but I was really moved and touched because I was actually not on a list, but I was nominated by the district. So I attended the convention, and I think that's certainly true as I read through that several times. But I have to say, I think that the convention and the break was more than just that. I mean, much more than that. And a lot of it had to do with the context, which was the Soviet Union at that time collapsing. I remember sitting in New York the table with the New York Times in front of me and reading the headlines, because it was actually happening concurrent with that convention. Aptheker speaking, and I remember Travis Steiner and others at that convention. So my take is a little bit different than that. Oh, that is certainly a component of it. And I think, in fact, I hate to say this, but a big factor was simply leadership change. I think everyone in the party sensed that the Gus Hall era was ending soon, and people were lining up, and there's a lot of sycophancy. I mean, my regard for the Communist Party is higher than for any other organization in this country, but you have to be honest about it. And so, yeah, I mean, that was a factor in it. Charlie Mitchell was a stellar leader in the party. In fact, my first work after I got around the party, before I joined, was around the National Alliance, which Professor Horne talks about and her role in it, and Angela Davis's role. I met Angela Davis. I served on security for things. So, yeah, it was a factor. It was a factor. So, but I'm just pleased that this is open now. I mean, I don't know anybody else. Correct me if I'm wrong. I know there's an article by Daniel Rosenberg, who I saw the draft of, and I talked about it, which you cite. But other than that, I don't think anyone is really seriously scholarly looking into it the way you are. And I think it's time. I mean, you need a little history to pass before you revisit this, to soak it up and think about it. But I'm glad you brought that in, and I hope we can have many conversations with people who are involved and engaged in it, because it has, I think, an important place in how we go forward, as you say, as you point out.
Well, let me urge you to write a memoir. Let me urge you to put between two book covers your recollections, because you mentioned my footnotes. If you'll notice, I rely heavily upon the recollections of Angela Davis in terms of her autobiography, of Bettina Aptheker in terms of some of the work that she's done. I rely heavily upon the archive of Angela Davis at Harvard, the records about her trial that are microfilm at different universities, the Communist Party archives at New York University, for example. So you cannot begin to tell this story with the kind of granular detail and texture that's required unless people themselves are recollecting their own experiences, unless people themselves are putting their papers and archives in different libraries. For example, my archive is in the New York Public Library at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem, for example. So this is all part of telling a story that hopefully future generations can benefit from. Because the book that we're now discussing, as I see it, I see it as not the final word. Matter of fact, it's difficult to speak, in my estimation, of any book of history as being the final word. Because what happens is that new records emerge. I mean, for example, let's say that you write a memoir that challenges and is proven to be accurate some of the things that I've published, then a new author would come along and incorporate your findings. And that'll be an entirely new story. So history is an ongoing process. As we used to say back in the day, it's argument without end. And it's argument without end because new sources arise. Not only do new sources arise, but our perspectives change. Our perspective changes. I mean, for example, when the Soviet Union collapses, the way people begin to look at that experience from 1917 to 1991 begins to change. And then maybe it changes again by 2024 when there are those who begin to see that the United States may have overdetermined Moscow in its calculations and somehow built up the People's Republic of China to the point where it's now challenging US imperialism on all fronts. And of course, that's a sub-theme of this book at hand, because part of what leads to the rupture between the Black Panther Party and the Communist Party is that the Black Panther Party goes all in with regard to Maoism, for example. And I don't think I'm talking out of school to suggest that the Communist Party was not so oriented. And that leads to different ruptures, fissures, splits, arguments, etc., which ultimately was not to the benefit of our movement as a whole.
Bring up a good point, because I remember, I don't remember a lot well because I'm getting on in years, but I remember this vividly. I remember the battles here in Pittsburgh. The district organizer in Pittsburgh of the Communist Party was Rasheed Story, who you may know or may have known in the past. And there was a forum, and one of the local representatives of Baraka's party, which supported UNITA and all the wrong, quote unquote, liberation movements, spoke. And he was a very dynamic speaker. I mean, Rasheed more than held his own, but we were in the minority. Our viewpoint was in the minority because Maoism, there were all these new communist parties that had emerged that were tied and linked with Maoism, and most people were there to support that. Of course, to tell a little tale here, that speaker then became a city councilman in Pittsburgh years later, and a reliable Democrat, and had a very, very robust career. And you know what I'm talking about. So, but we were struggling. I mean, that was part of the battle at that time, was to try to defend these liberation movements, and it was very important. But you bring that back to me as I'm reading. That's why it's taking me so long to read your book, because I'm relishing these moments, recalling these times.
I should also mention that I'm a historian, but I consider myself to be a politico as well. And I consider myself to be a diplomat as well. And so I'm walking a fine line in this book, because with all of this serious talk nowadays about the hot breath of fascism breathing down our necks in the United States of America, as a political person, as a diplomat, I don't necessarily want to alienate those who I will share an anti-fascist trench with. But at the same time, I want to tell a comprehensive and accurate story that may not reflect well upon some of the people I'm sharing an anti-fascist trench with.
I want to ask you about that, because while I was reading it, it occurred to me, anyone reading your book and hearing talk today, which is kind of loose talk about fascism or imminent fascism, and you look at the kind of repression that occurred in the McCarthy era, the kind of repression that was directed against the new left to a small degree, but most importantly through COINTELPRO, the Black Panther Party. And those times were times when the left was strong. We're in a period now where the left is very weak. It's hard for me to imagine that talk of fascism being imminent is really very productive. I don't mind it. It doesn't annoy me, but it just doesn't seem appropriate when we've lived through, we've known people living through, we work with people who lived through times of great repression, of incredible repression. And people wanted to label that fascism, but we don't look back and say that was fascism.
Well, you know, it's interesting. One of the stories I tell in the book is how in the early 1950s, there were those in the Communist Party who were operating on the premise that fascism was nigh. There were others in the Communist Party who did not agree with that political estimate, because they said, well, look at Alabama, where you have the rise of this anti-Jim Crow movement spearheaded by Dr. King and Rosa Parks. You have Black bookstores that are open. You have even Marxist bookstores that are open. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, in the era of George Jackson in the 1960s, you had a revival of this idea. As a matter of fact, he said fascism had already arrived. And there were those, including Angela Davis and others, who disagreed with him. The problem was, of course, that later discussion of fascism oftentimes did not refer to that earlier discussion of fascism. That's point number one. Point number two, of course, is that one of the arts that we've lost, I think, or I should say more accurately and precisely, that has eroded in recent years, is the art of making a political estimate. Because in order to develop a strategy and tactics, you need to make a political estimate. Just like if you're a general on the battlefield, in order to draw a plan, you have to have an estimate of who's on the other side of the barricades, for example. And sometimes I don't necessarily see any evidence of a political estimate. And in fact, one of the criticisms I make of the Panthers is that when there were those who talked about launching armed struggle, they really never did a political estimate. They never really did a domestic and global estimate looking at the correlation of forces, the constellation of forces. It was based on impressions, so to speak, based, for example, about what was happening behind prison walls, for example, which, to be sure, should have been part of a calculation, but to act as if that were the end all and be all was perhaps a miscalculation.
You make you make a couple of points. You don't pursue it, but you certainly lead a reader to believe that there was good and bad in the Black Panther Party. There was a healthy element and there was a not so healthy element. And I must say, more often than not, it looks like it's Eldridge Cleaver that's the unhealthy element. And
right.
I don't know if you want to elaborate much on that, but that's kind of clear, I think, in your writing, as there are in all political movements. I mean, all political movements have healthy elements and not so healthy elements. But do you think if the Black Panther Party had not been affected with infiltration, with some bad leadership like Cleaver and others, that it would have found its way forward and still remain? I mean, how do you account for its demise? Because its fundamental premises were correct.
Mm-hmm. Pat, did you want to interject something?
Well, yes, I did. I in preparation for this, I watched Eldridge Cleaver and on William F. Buckley's firing line.
Oh my goodness.
And I came away with a couple of things. First of all, you get a little distracted because everybody's a pig. Everybody's a pig. You know, they're okay. So that's fine. When you look at what he's actually talking about, he's really right on the money. You know, we don't have representation in court with a period of our with our peers trying us. That he was for housing and food. And helping poor. He didn't really talk that much about Black people. He talked about the whole class situation of poverty. And at the end, Buckley was just an asshole. I mean, he just was. This was back when the liberal, when the elites were conservative. Now they're liberal elites, but and he made an awful lot of sense. But if you really listen to what he was saying, it was very much of a strong socialist, Marxist orientation. Now I realize he went off the rails a little bit towards the end of his life, but watch it. It's amazing. It's actually very lucid, good policy. That was my comment.
Well, Cleaver was a contradictory figure, to put it mildly. On the one hand, he had these positive attributes that you just articulated. He was quite well read. That's another thing about many of these prisoners. Many of these prisoners, like George Jackson, they're quite well read because they have a lot of time in prison to pore over tomes.
And professors that give them books.
Exactly. So he was quite well read, even when his deviations became evident and clear. You still had solid comrades who were praising him. Now, what do I mean by deviations becoming clear? Of course, he becomes a conservative Christian. He becomes a designer of sexy men's pants with a codpiece, for example. He is an admitted and acknowledged rapist. He battered women. He was homophobic. So he's a bundle of contradictions. And for the narrative arc of my book, since Southern California is the focus, and since he came to maturity in Southern California, I focus quite a bit on him as a character, which might be a bit distorting because of his contradictions. But then again, I focus quite a bit on Angela Davis as a character as well, because she was a graduate student at the University of California, San Diego, was a professor at UCLA, for example. I focus quite a bit on Cyril Briggs, who is an unacknowledged thinker and leader of the Communist Party with roots in the Caribbean, who had a heroic story in the World War I era, forming the African Blood Brotherhood, which was a kind of precursor of the Che Lumumba Club of the Communist Party, to which Angela Davis belonged. So when you focus on a particular geographical region, it has pluses and minuses. The plus is, I think you can tell a more graphic story. You can tell a story that perhaps the reader can envision how it emerges from the very soil. But on the other hand, it leads you to focus intently on certain characters in that region and focus not so much on other characters, for example, who are not part of that region.
Let's talk a little bit about the FBI.
Oh.
I was watching Amy Goodman, Democracy Now! 2 days ago, and they have a new author. I'd really like to get her on our podcast, Demetra Wilson, who wrote a book called Dynamite Nashville, FBI's role in the civil rights era bombing revealed, linked to later racist attacks. The bottom line is there were some bombings occurring in late 1959-60 in Tennessee, and they were done with the knowledge of the FBI. In fact, the FBI informant was involved with these bombings, totally covered up. She ended up investigating with the modern tools that we have now, Google and better research tools. And now they're opening up an investigation of the FBI's problems and how they were responding to a lot of these events that were occurring back then. We had Interpol. The FBI were really problematic with their surveillance, infiltration, planting evidence. They're rogue. I mean, they really are rogue, and they're horrible. And they got what they wanted. They destroyed the party. They created a lot of division within it. I don't know. Tell me, to what extent was the FBI responsible for having this party only last 10 years and finally just fizzle out and go away?
Well, Greg, did you want to interject something? I thought I heard you.
No. I'm listening. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. So
I want to bring something up a bit later after you finish with this.
Do you need a couple of minutes to go get your FBI file, Greg? And you want to,
got several files.
You could read it, and we'll have like soft music behind it.
I just want everyone to know what my number is, because I've got 2 numbers assigned to my name, and I'm very proud of that. So
okay, all right.
I think everybody should be. Go ahead.
FBI
and the relationship to this organization.
So they played a preeminent role. Recall that the FBI has about a 100-year history, which is not to say that dirty tricks in the United States against progressive and radical movements have a 100-year history. It's only to say that the FBI, as we know it, is associated with its early director, speaking of J. Edgar Hoover, who had roots in Washington, D.C., where he spent most of his life, even before COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, which comes into existence in 1956, the FBI had been engaged in dirty tricks against the Black nationalist movement of Marcus Garvey, the Communist Party, for example. But I think it's fair to say that there's a great leap backwards with regard to dirty tricks with COINTELPRO. John Abt, ABT, who was the Communist Party counsel says in his memoir that about maybe 60% of the dirty tricks of the FBI were directed against the Communist Party, though, of course, with the arising of the anti-Jim Crow movement in the mid-1950s and then the rising of the Black Panther Party a decade or so later, they began to turn their fire against those particular movements, up to and including wiretapping, trying to break up couples, for example, trying to spur violence between and amongst different political factions within the Black movement, which they were able to do successfully, I'm afraid to say. I mean, I could go on in this vein. The only good news is that they left a lot of breadcrumbs. I mean, they're voluminous records,
right,
for a historian to pore over. Of course, you have to use these records cautiously and oftentimes read them against the grain, so to speak. But still, there are records that will be keeping historians busy for decades to come.
Yeah, I didn't want to let this end without bringing up something, a controversy on the left, your thesis about settler colonialism. I haven't read enough about it to have an opinion, so it sounds to me, I mean, I equate Australia, the United States, South Africa, a number of states with that word, but it's taken on such a caricature and it's taken on such great import on many of people on the left. I'd like to give you a chance to talk about it because I need to know more about what it is. Maybe I'll agree with you, maybe I won't, but I don't know enough about it, but I think we'd be remiss in not talking about it because it's obsessing a lot on the left. They have their drawers in an uproar about settler colonialism as a thesis. So could you elaborate on that? I mean, a bit?
Well, I think point number one is that the recent deployment of that term has a lot to do with what's going on in historic Palestine. That is to say, as you know, in recent months, we've had this spectacular efflorescence of student protests with regard to Israeli war crimes. And those who have become transfixed by this scenario across the Atlantic have begun to attach themselves to this concept of settler colonialism, which they apply to historic Palestine. Now, it was inevitable that once they began to look at historic Palestine through that lens, they begin to look at North America through that lens as well. You may know that I've done at least 2 books with settler colonialism in the title, one dealing with the 16th century and one dealing with the 17th century. And one of the political points that emerges, in my estimation, from a study of settler colonialism is that it helps to clarify the class question. What I mean by that is, in my book on the 16th century, I point out that with the invasion, my term, of what the English term North Carolina in the 1580s, that it was a class collaborationist process from the beginning, with the 1% in London, to use that current US phrase, sponsoring a multi-class conglomeration, not only of English men and women, but also Portuguese Catholics. And that's breaking the barrier with regard to what could be called the religious Cold War, because of course the first movers, speaking of the Spanish, it's no accident that most of the folks in this hemisphere speak Spanish, they had these religious qualifications for settlement and for leadership, which London broke with, which allowed it to broaden the basis for being a settler, which then in turn allowed them to recruit more widely with regard to gain settlers to confront the Native Americans and eventually to enslave the Africans. And I think that part of the problem of the US left has been a seeming inability to understand class collaboration. which inherits in settler colonialism. Roscoe Proctor, who you may have known, a Black communist stevedore out of the Bay Area, in dealing with the Panthers, he suggested that the Panthers did not have sufficient confidence in the working class. He's looking at the votes for George Wallace, for example. If he were around today, he might be looking at the votes for Donald J. Trump, for example. And then that led them to various deviations. For example, latching onto this concept of the lumpen as being the motive force of history, which was a real blunder. But where does that come from? Or if you look at what's happened in the United States this week with regard to the Zionist lobby notching another victory by knocking off Cori Bush, a progressive Black congresswoman out of St. Louis, after knocking off Jamal Bowman in New York. I mean, at a certain point, if you look at the history of the United States of America, you have to not only begin to analyze class collaboration as it inherits in settler colonialism, you also have to stop giving the United States breaks when it comes to comparing the United States with Europe. I mean, for example, I recall in my political education classes, the idea was that the United States was a more advanced bourgeois democracy than some of its counterparts in Europe because the Jewish community received a better deal in the United States of America. Another way to look at that is that settler colonialism involved a wide recruitment for settlers, and therefore that included Jewish settlers such as Judah P. Benjamin, one of the 2 or 3 top leaders of the Confederate States of America, for example. That included Senator David Yulee of Florida, one of the top congressional and slaveholding forces. And so threaded throughout this book that we're not talking about are theses that I've put forward in earlier books, particularly with regard to settler colonialism, because I think that it clarifies the class question. And also in terms of clarifying the class question, I also try to begin to look at the Black community or the enslaved community as the unpaid sector of the working class, which then causes one to set aside that moldy formulation, which communists often use, about the working class and the Negro people, as if the Negro people were not part of the working class. They're something apart. They're just the unpaid sector of the working class. And once you begin to analyze the unpaid sector of the working class, you begin to see that in every instance, their interests are not necessarily in accord with the wage sector of the working class or the skilled sector of the working class. So at a certain point, I think that we of the United States, we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to this planet to begin to engage in deeper understandings, deeper investigations of how and why it is that US imperialism is leading this small planet to the brink of destruction.
Right. What's next? What are you working on next?
Slavery in Washington, D.C.
Oh, Washington, D.C.
You actually had Washington, D.C., amongst its many, quote, charms, unquote, is that at one time, it was one of the major centers of slave trading, believe it or not, right at the foot of the Capitol. You had people in the Capitol talking about, and this is what I mean about, these peons of praise to bourgeois democracy, et cetera, where you're having Africans being sold and bid upon within walking distance of folks debating the so-called finer points of democracy. So that book, look for it next year.
Good. I just finished Tim Egan's.
Slow down a little bit. Slow down because I can't keep up with your
I
writing.
know. I just
Really, I get a book and then I say, I'm going to read that in a few weeks after I catch up. And then there's another book. So it's just, I appreciate you keep writing, but slow down a little bit. It's just too much.
Well, I'd like to also tell people that you're on LA's radio. What is it? KPFK, something like that.
KPFK.org, 11 a.m. Pacific on Saturdays.
It is good. It is good. I go and I watch your YouTube. You come in and with a wide variety of topics, some current, some not, and it's a nice way to keep up on what you're dealing with too. So,
and also I'm trying to acquaint our audience with some of these historical theses, but not necessarily from my mouth, but from the mouth of other scholars. Because what's happening is that these scholars are turning out a torrent of work. And oftentimes the activist community, because maybe they're busy raising children or at work, they're not keeping up. And so I'm bringing on these scholars to acquaint them with these new historiographical trends.
Right. And they do a great job interviewing you and engaging. So yeah, that's I look at what I knew 2 years ago before I read your Ben Davis book and what I know now, and it's just, it's amazing how ignorant I was and how brilliant I am now. Having it it reminds me of in grad school, you'd go out and have beers with your professors after class, and that was the best part, just chatting and engaging. That's kind of what I think this is. This has been so much fun. I appreciate you coming on, and we'll keep in touch, okay?
Please, I insist.
And when you
We'll do it
and
again.
you're gonna love BC, and so if you're in Seattle area, I'm always good for a strong cup of coffee or an IPA or whatever. So
Well, I need to find a residence first, so keep me posted.
okay, all right, thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you.